I pretended to be a stranger's brother to pull her out of a cult, and now she's my family for real. The gate at Stillwater Ranch was already grinding shut when I hit the gas. Gravel spraying off my back tires so hard, I heard it hit the undercarriage like buckshot. Naomi had her hand fisted in my sleeve, knuckles white, breath coming in these short, ragged pulls that didn't sound like breathing, so much as something trying to escape a smaller space than it needed. In the headlights, I could see Elias Thorne, standing dead center of the exit road, arms loose at his sides, not moving, like he had all the time in the world and I was the one who'd forgotten that. Behind him, two men in matching canvas jackets were jogging toward the gate controls. I remember thinking, with this strange, clean clarity that only shows up when your body has already decided to panic and your mind is just catching up, that if I stopped the car now, I would never get her out again. So I didn't stop. Thorne stepped aside at the last possible second, close enough that I saw his face through the windshield, calm, almost amused, like he was watching weather roll in rather than watching someone take something from him. That was the night I learned exactly how far a man will go to keep something he's decided belongs to him. But if I start there, none of it will make sense yet. So let me back up. 3 months, to a folding table at the Saturday market, and a woman selling honey who wouldn't meet my eyes. I do sound work for a living, freelance, mostly ambient recording for meditation apps and the occasional true crime podcast that wants creaky floor atmosphere. That morning, I was capturing crowd noise for a client's project near the flower stalls when I noticed the booth 2 rows over, a hand-lettered sign reading Stillwater Apiary, raw honey and herbal tinctures, and a young woman behind it who moved like every gesture had been rehearsed and then drained of anything that made it hers. She wore a long gray dress in June heat, sleeves down to her wrists, and when a customer asked her a second question about the tincture dosage, a man standing at the corner of the booth checked his watch and said her name sharply enough that 3 people nearby turned their heads. Not her name, I'd learn later. A name given to her. Elowen. She apologized to the customer, apologized to the man, apologized in a voice so practiced it barely sounded like an apology at all anymore, just a shape her mouth knew how to make. I bought a jar of honey I didn't need so I'd have a reason to stand there another 30 seconds, and when she handed me my change, her sleeve rode up an inch and I saw a rope burn healing along the inside of her wrist, pink and raw at the edges. I want to be honest about why that stopped me the way it did, because it wasn't just decency, and I've had 3 months and a lot of therapy since to sit with that. 7 years ago, my mother died of ovarian cancer over 11 brutal months, and afterward I went to a grief support group in a church basement in southeast Portland because a hospice counselor told me isolation kills people slower than cancer does. A woman there, warm and soft-spoken, kept sitting next to me, kept asking about my finances in a roundabout way that felt like care at the time, kept inviting me to a retreat where I could set the weight down. My friend Theo Bramante, who I'd known since college and who has never once let me make a decision alone without an opinion attached, told me the whole thing gave him a bad feeling he couldn't name, and I skipped the retreat because I didn't want to drive 4 hours by myself. I never thought about that woman again until the day I saw Naomi's wrist and felt something in my chest tilt sideways, recognition without a name attached to it yet. I didn't know then how close that recognition would come to being literal. I went back the next week, telling myself it was for the honey, which was a lie I stopped believing by the second jar. She was there again, thinner in the face than 7 days should account for, a fresh mark at her hairline that could have been from a branch or could have been from something else, and this time the man watching her, who I'd later learn was called Casimir Dubray inside the group, an auditor, clocked me before I reached the table. He asked, too casually, whether I'd been by before. I said maybe, that the honey was good, and he said something about energetic consistency that I didn't understand and wasn't meant to. Naomi's eyes flicked to mine for less than a second, and in that second she did something that still keeps me up some nights. She wrote a name on the back of my receipt while making change. Not help me, nothing so clean, just her real name, Naomi, pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the letters with my thumb before I even looked down. A crack in a mask she'd been wearing so long I don't think she remembered it was one. That night I typed Stillwater Ranch into a search bar at 1 in the morning and found exactly 4 results worth anything. A defunct forum thread with half its posts deleted by request, a decade-old zoning dispute, a scrubbed news brief about a wellness community lawsuit that had been quietly settled, and a single still-active username, Petra.s, whose last post read only, "If anyone reading this has a sister or daughter at Stillwater, get a lawyer before you get a plan." I found Petra Solheim 2 weeks later at a diner off Sandy Boulevard, and she watched me for a full minute before she said anything, like she was deciding whether I was a journalist, a lawyer, or something worse. She'd left the fellowship 2 years before Naomi ever arrived, after 4 years inside, and she talked about it the way people talk about a car accident they walked away from, flat and precise, because precise was the only way to get through it without shaking. She told me about the audits, hours of interrogation about your thoughts framed as spiritual cleansing, about sleep cut to 5 hours so your judgment stayed pliable, about a ledger the senior members called the Book of Vessels that tracked not just tithes but net worth, inheritances, pending trusts. She told me the group's real talent wasn't recruiting the lonely, it was recruiting the recently bereaved, specifically because grief makes people generous with their trust in a way nothing else does. She told me her own cousin had gotten her out, 3 years earlier, by posing as a long-estranged brother during the 1 week a year the fellowship allowed supervised family visits to satisfy a court order from an earlier lawsuit. She said it worked because grief groups and family estrangements were the group's whole business model, and nobody at the gate double-checks a stranger's face against a family tree nobody there has ever seen. That detail sat in me for days before I understood what it was doing there. I drove to a quiet street in Beaverton to find Naomi's father, Walter Wexler, a soft, tired-looking man in his 60s who answered the door already flinching before I finished my second sentence. He said he'd tried once, 3 years back, driving out with Naomi's older brother to bring her home, and it had gone so badly that Naomi had written him a letter afterward accusing him of things that weren't true, in language that wasn't hers, and he hadn't heard her voice since. He said he was afraid that trying again and failing again would be the thing that finally lost her forever, and I understood that fear even as it made me want to shake him. Her brother, Desmond Wexler, was harder to find, and harder still to talk to once I did. A clipped voice on the phone from Seattle, who told me flatly that he wasn't interested in getting burned twice by a family that had already chosen its side. It took 2 more calls and 1 long silence before he told me, almost as an afterthought, that their mother, Corinne, had given up a baby for adoption at 19, years before she married Walter, a son placed through Willow Creek Placement Services in 1994, a half-brother neither he nor Naomi had ever met, and the fellowship had no possible way of knowing existed. I want to be clear that the plan that came out of that phone call sounded insane out loud, and Theo told me so, twice, once sober and once after 2 beers when he said it plainer. Petra had already proven the method worked, though, and the fellowship was due, within 6 weeks, to hold its annual homecoming rite, an open visitation day it was legally obligated to allow under the same settlement Petra had mentioned, the one that came out of a lawsuit years earlier when a different family had sued over being denied all contact with an adult member. Desmond dug an old adoption file out of a storage unit in Tacoma, yellowed and real, a name on it, Julian, and a case file number that meant nothing to anyone but proved everything to people who needed proof more than truth. Petra still had one contact quietly working inside, a young woman everyone called Birdie who handled outgoing mail and could, if she was careful, get a note folded inside a returned jar to Naomi ahead of the rite. The note said only that a cousin on her mother's side would be asking for her, that she should go along with whatever he said, that this was real. I spent 5 weeks becoming a man named Julian who had never existed until I decided to be him, memorizing a mother's maiden name, a childhood address, a story about searching for roots after a DNA test, because if I hesitated even once at that gate, Naomi would still be inside it when the sun came up. The morning of the rite, Stillwater Ranch looked almost gentle from the county road, white outbuildings and long rows of lavender and a hand-painted sign that could have belonged to any struggling farm in eastern Oregon, and that gentleness was its own kind of violence once you knew what it was hiding. A folding table stood at the entrance with a woman checking names against a clipboard, and I gave her Julian, told the story about the adoption file with my voice doing a passable job of sounding steadier than my hands felt, and watched her expression shift from bored to uncertain to something that made her walk the clipboard directly to a man standing near the barn who I recognized immediately from the market. Elias Thorne, tall and unhurried in a way that felt performed, watching me approach with an attention that made my skin want to leave my body. He asked me 3 questions that only a real half-brother of Naomi's could plausibly answer, and I answered 2 of them clean because Desmond had given me the truth, and stumbled on the third in a way that, mercifully, read as grief rather than fraud, because I let it. He studied me a long moment, said something about the fellowship believing in the healing of severed bonds, and told a young man to escort Julian to the visitor's tent for 10 supervised minutes, no more. I was not prepared for what it did to me, watching her walk toward that tent and seeing her face do something I hadn't planned for, a flicker of real grief crossing real relief, because somewhere in the last 5 weeks I had stopped thinking about the fact that the half-brother she was meeting really had existed once, really had been lost to that family, and some small, unguarded part of her was mourning a person I was only pretending to be while also, impossibly, being grateful he'd come. Casimir stood 4 feet away with his arms crossed the entire 10 minutes, so I built the extraction plan inside a conversation about our mother's grave, told her I wanted to take her to see it, watched her eyes catch the second meaning and hold it without her face changing at all, a skill the fellowship had trained into her for exactly the wrong purpose, and that was now, finally, working for her instead of against her. At the closing bonfire that evening, as families were herded back toward the gravel lot, she told Casimir she needed the outhouse near the tree line, and I was already moving toward my Subaru parked behind the equipment shed, where Desmond had told me visitors sometimes idled during the long goodbyes, engine running, headlights off. We made it maybe 40 yards through the brush before a bell started ringing somewhere behind us, a head count alarm Petra had warned me about, but that still hit my chest like a physical thing, and I could hear Casimir shouting a name that wasn't Naomi's real one into the dark. She stumbled once on a route, and I hauled her up by the arm harder than I meant to, and we hit the car at a dead run, and that's the gate you already know about. Thorne standing in the road like weather, stepping aside at the last second, because even he, I think, understood the math of a witness list versus one runaway. I did not know, driving those first 10 miles with my hands locked on the wheel and Naomi silent beside me except for that awful shallow breathing, that the hardest part of the story hadn't started yet. I thought getting her out was the ending. I had no idea it was barely the middle. The first week she stayed with me was not the reunion I'd built up in my head on the drive back. She flinched at the sound of my apartment's radiator clicking on. She ate almost nothing, and when I finally got her to eat, her body reacted to real food like it was an insult, and I spent 1-3 in the morning on the phone with a nurse line while she was doubled over on my bathroom floor, sweating through a t-shirt that wasn't hers. Theo, who'd been skeptical of the whole plan from the start, showed up the second morning with groceries and didn't say a word about being right, just quietly became the person who sat with her when I had to leave for work, which told me more about him than any apology could have. I called around until I found Dr. Renata Okafor, a clinical psychologist who specialized in coercive control and had testified in 2 prior cases involving high-demand groups, and she saw Naomi within 4 days, documenting bruising consistent with restraint, malnutrition markers, and a pattern of dissociative response, she said, carefully, was entirely consistent with prolonged psychological conditioning rather than anything close to a diagnosis Naomi should carry as an identity. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line in Kestrel County the same week, hoping for some kind of official acknowledgement of what I'd watched happen at that gate, and the deputy who eventually called back told me, not unkindly, that an adult who chose to leave a religious community and then chose to visit her family wasn't a police matter, and that without an active complaint from Naomi herself specifying a crime, there was nothing to open. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone still warm against my ear, thinking that I had just watched a man block a car with his own body, and the system's answer was a shrug shaped like a form letter. Within 9 days, Thorne's lawyer sent a certified letter to my apartment accusing me of unlawful interference in a family reconciliation matter and demanding Naomi return voluntarily to complete her spiritual commitments. A phrase I read out loud twice before I understood it was actually a threat wearing church clothes. 2 days after that, a Kestrel County deputy called again, different tone entirely, because now there was a formal complaint on file, this one accusing me of transporting an adult across county lines against her will, and I spent 4 hours in an interview room answering questions before I was released without charges, mostly because Naomi, shaking but resolute, told them herself that she had left willingly. I hired Malcolm Osei on Theo's recommendation, a family law attorney who'd handled 2 prior extraction cases and who told me plainly, in our first meeting, that the law in Oregon does not care how a person got free, only whether they choose, once free, to stay that way, and that our entire case would need to be built on Naomi's own documented, ongoing choice, rather than anything I had done at that gate. He filed for a temporary protective order the same week, which the fellowship's attorneys contested within 72 hours, and for a while it felt like every step forward cost us 2 steps somewhere else, Naomi gaining 4 pounds while a new letter arrived claiming she'd signed over financial power of attorney to a holding company months before I ever met her, a claim that turned out, eventually, to be devastatingly close to true. There was one good week in there, and I want to hold on to it the way I did at the time, because it mattered, even though it didn't last. Naomi started sleeping through full nights. She laughed once, at something small Theo said about his terrible cooking, and the sound of it surprised her as much as it did us, like she'd forgotten her own laugh existed. She asked me, quietly, one evening, why I'd actually done any of it, and I told her the truth, that I'd seen her wrist and something in me that had been waiting 7 years to matter finally had somewhere to go. Then the second letter from Thorne's attorney arrived, this one threatening a defamation and religious harassment suit naming me specifically, citing my impersonation of a deceased woman's estranged child for the purpose of fraudulent extraction, and Naomi read 3 lines of it standing at my kitchen counter before her hands started shaking so badly the paper made a sound like a small dry storm, and that night she was gone from the apartment before I woke up. Theo found her 4 hours later at a Greyhound station downtown, sitting very still on a bench with a one-way ticket to a town 40 miles from the ranch folded in her coat pocket, unbought, just held, like she'd been rehearsing the decision without letting herself finish it. He didn't call the police. He didn't call me first either, which I understood later was the right choice. He just sat down next to her and talked about nothing, his terrible ex-girlfriend, a podcast episode that went badly, until she started crying and let him walk her to his car. When I got there, she wouldn't look at me, said she didn't know who she was without the fellowship's voice telling her, that at least there she knew the rules, that freedom felt like standing in a room with no walls, and she didn't know yet how to stand in a room with no walls. Dr. Okafor told me later this was not a setback, that it was, in fact, almost textbook, that the pullback toward a controlling structure often peaks not at the moment of leaving but weeks later, once the adrenaline fades and the mind starts grieving the certainty it lost, even while hating what the certainty had cost. Knowing that didn't make the phone call from Theo hurt any less in the moment. We needed more than my testimony and a psychologist's report if we were going to survive the countersuit and get Naomi anything close to real safety, so Malcolm brought in Dana Kowalczyk, an investigative reporter who'd spent 2 years circling high-control groups in the Pacific Northwest without ever finding a source willing to go on record, and Petra, after a long conversation with Naomi that I wasn't part of and never asked about, agreed to be that source. Dana's early digging turned up a name buried in old property records, a shell entity called Willowmere Holdings that owned the ranch outright and received wire transfers from a rotating cast of LLCs with names like Renewal Partners and Cascade Fellowship Trust, none of which existed anywhere except on paper. She brought in a forensic accountant, Victor Amici, who specialized in nonprofit fraud, and it was Victor who first put a number on what had actually happened to Naomi's inheritance. An $82,000 drain over 2 years, disguised as counseling fees, spiritual education costs, and land maintenance assessments, billed directly against a trust her mother had set up to protect her, not empty it. It was also Victor, 3 weeks into the financial audit, who called me at 9 at night and asked, in a voice that had gone very careful, whether I had ever attended a grief support event connected to a church in Southeast Portland 7 years earlier. I told him I had, once, and he was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. He'd found an old outreach spreadsheet, scrubbed from most of the group's current systems but preserved in a backup Dana had gotten through a source inside a defunct printing vendor, a list of names flagged by a recruiter called Miriam Doss under the heading Prospective, Recently Bereaved, No Immediate Family Support, and 4 rows down, dated the same month as that basement grief group, was my name, my mother's date of death, and a note that read simply, Declined retreat invitation, follow-up lapsed. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time after that call ended, trying to hold 2 facts in my head at once, that I had almost been exactly where Naomi was, and that the reason I wasn't had nothing to do with being smarter or stronger. It was Theo's bad feeling, and a 4-hour drive I didn't want to make alone. It reframed everything. I hadn't recognized something in Naomi at that honey stall out of some vague, generous instinct. I had recognized the shape of a door I'd almost walked through myself. Around the same time, the county's response finally started to shift, though not because anyone in it suddenly grew a conscience. A social worker assigned early on to assess whether Naomi was competent to make her own decisions had, for weeks, leaned toward the fellowship's framing that this was a religious liberty matter, and the family, meaning me now by proxy, were the ones interfering, and it took Dr. Okafor's full written evaluation, plus Naomi's own steady, increasingly clear testimony in a closed hearing, to move that needle. The county prosecutor initially declined to pursue any financial charges, citing the awkward fact that the ranch itself sat inside Kestrel County, while the shell company's banking ran through an address one county over, a jurisdictional gap the fellowship's lawyers had clearly built into their paperwork on purpose. It was only after Dana's first article ran, headlined with numbers instead of adjectives, that the Oregon Attorney General's office opened its own inquiry. And once wire transfers started crossing state lines toward a holding account in Nevada, the FBI's white-collar unit got involved too, which is a sentence I never expected to write about a compound with lavender rose and a hand-painted sign. Somewhere in that stretch a threat pulse arrived that never got resolved and probably never will. A dark sedan sat outside my building for 3 consecutive nights, engine running, exhaust curling up under a streetlight, and on the 3rd night when I finally walked out to look at it directly, it pulled away before I got within 20 feet, plates too mud-streaked to read. Kestrel County said it wasn't in their jurisdiction. Portland police took a report and told me, gently, that there wasn't much to investigate about a parked car. A week after that, someone left a dead sparrow on my welcome mat, wings arranged with a deliberateness that felt less like an animal's death and more like a sentence I wasn't meant to finish reading. No one was ever charged with either thing. I don't know, still, whether either was the fellowship at all or just my own frayed nerves finding shapes in ordinary bad luck, and that not knowing is its own kind of exhausting, a low hum under everything else that never fully goes quiet. Birdie, the young woman inside who'd smuggled that first note to Naomi, was discovered going through outgoing mail more closely than she should have 3 weeks after the rite, and the fellowship expelled her the way they expelled anyone who stopped being useful, dropped at a gas station 40 miles from the ranch with a garbage bag of her belongings and no phone, no money, no plan. Petra drove out and got her the same night, and Birdie ended up on Petra's couch for 2 months, while she relearned how to hold a job interview without apologizing for existing, and I carried a guilt about that for a long time, the knowledge that helping Naomi had cost this other young woman everything she'd built inside a system that was, at least, familiar to her. Naomi carried it worse than I did. She wrote Birdie a letter she never sent, then sent it anyway, and the two of them talk most weeks now, in a way that has nothing performed left in it at all. The legal reckoning, when it finally came, was not the clean courtroom drama I'd pictured back when this was still just an idea, in a diner booth with Petra. Thorne's attorneys fought the protective order line by line, and there was an afternoon outside the Kestrel County Courthouse, after a hearing that had gone badly for reasons that had nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with procedure, when Thorne passed close enough to say, quietly, that families like mine were the reason people needed places like his, borrowed families, he called it, playing house with someone else's blood, and something in me that I had been holding together with sheer stubbornness for 3 months finally gave. I don't remember crossing the distance between us. I remember Malcolm's hand locked hard around my forearm and my own voice, unrecognizable, saying something I won't repeat, and I remember shaking for 20 minutes afterward in Malcolm's car while he told me, not unkindly, that if I'd connected that punch I would have handed Thorne's lawyers the only gift they hadn't managed to manufacture themselves. Dana's second article, the one with Victor's full financial trail and 5 additional former members on the record, including 2 elderly retirees who'd signed over retirement accounts under the same counseling fee scheme, ran the following month and did what 9 years of scattered forum posts never could. It went past the regional papers within a day. The Attorney General's office announced a formal fraud investigation within the week, and 11 days after that, federal agents executed a warrant at Stillwater Ranch itself, and Thorne was arrested on the gravel drive I'd once driven a Subaru down at 40 miles an hour, with Naomi's hand locked in my sleeve. He was charged with wire fraud and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, though the coercive control charges Malcolm had hoped for never materialized, Oregon's laws not being built yet for what happens inside a place like that. A gap Dana's third article spent 4,000 words describing without managing to close it. Naomi testified at the preliminary hearing, and I sat behind her the whole time, close enough to see her hands shaking on the rail but not her voice, which came out steadier than I'd heard it since the day at the honey stall. She described the audits and the sleep schedules and the ledger with a precision that made 2 jurors visibly flinch, and when the defense attorney tried to suggest her memory was unreliable given the unconventional circumstances of her removal, she said, without looking at me, that every legitimate system meant to help her had already failed once, quietly, for years, and that the unconventional part was never the rescue. It was how long everyone else had waited to notice there was anything to rescue her from. Thorne eventually pleaded to a reduced set of financial charges rather than risk trial on all of them, and was sentenced to 11 years, with restitution ordered that Victor estimated would return victims somewhere between 30 and 40 cents on every dollar taken, which meant Naomi recovered a fraction of what her mother had actually left her. Enough to matter. Nowhere near enough to erase what it had cost to get it back. Desmond came to that sentencing, sitting 3 rows back with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, and afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, he and Naomi stood close enough to hug, and didn't, not yet, just talked in low voices for a long time, while Walter hovered a few feet off, looking like a man finally allowed back into a room he'd spent 3 years locked out of. It wasn't a reconciliation with a bow on it. Desmond still carries an anger toward himself for the years he spent away, and Walter still flinches sometimes at the sound of Naomi raising her voice about anything, old habits built during years of walking on eggshells around a daughter who'd been taught to weaponize her own grief against him. But they show up now. That's the whole of what got rebuilt, and it turned out to be enough to start on. I still don't know for certain whether that sedan outside my building or the sparrow on the mat had anything to do with the fellowship at all, and I've made a kind of uneasy peace with never knowing. The same peace Naomi says she's made with not knowing how many other names sat on Miriam Doss's old spreadsheet, how many other people got the follow-up call I never received. 2 members of Stillwater's inner circle were never charged with anything, having covered their financial tracks well enough to walk away when Thorne didn't, and as far as anyone knows, they're both still recruiting somewhere, under a different name, at a different grief group, in a different basement, and that's the sentence I fall asleep to more nights than I'd like to admit.